My name is Janice Dorgan, and I'm 34 years old. When I was 9, I froze on a stage, and my mother spent the next 25 years calling me the girl who shamed the family. When my father died, he left my brother a house and left me the violin he used to play beside my bed. Then my mother hired a lawyer to take even that. I didn't fight her in that room. I just held the case a little tighter. She didn't know my father had left something inside it, something meant only for me. That was the moment the ground shifted under all of them. Let me start where the shame began.
If this is already sitting heavy in your chest, take a second and let me know you're here. Tell me whether someone in your family ever turned one frightened moment into the name they used for you afterward. I'm Janice. This is the story of an old violin, a lawyer's letter, and the thing my father knew but never said out loud. To understand any of it, we have to go back to the winter I was 9 years old.
The recital was in December, in the basement hall of a church my parents did not attend. My father had entered me because, by then, he had been teaching me for about 3 years. At night, he would sit on the edge of my bed and draw the bow across the strings so slowly the notes seemed to breathe. He taught me to tune by ear before I could properly read music. He would pluck a string, close his eyes, and say, "There, do you hear where it wants to sit?" Somehow I did. At 9, playing was the one thing I knew I was good at. That night, I wore a green dress that itched at the collar. There were maybe 40 people on folding chairs. My father sat in the second row with his hands folded, and he was smiling like I had already done something remarkable. I walked out. I lifted the violin, and then the room got very bright and very far away, and every note I had ever learned simply left me. My fingers wouldn't move. My mind was a white sheet of nothing. I stood there for what felt like an hour, and then I started to cry. And then I ran off the little stage and out a side door into the cold. I remember the sound my shoes made on the linoleum. I remember one of my aunts saying, not quietly enough, "Poor thing, just froze." I remember standing in the dark parking lot, shaking, until my father came through the side door. He put his coat around my shoulders and walked me to the car without asking me to explain. My mother was waiting inside. She did not tell me it was okay. On the drive home, she said I had embarrassed the whole family. She repeated it the next week to her sister, then for years, at dinners and holidays, the way people tell a funny story about a dog that ruined a wedding. That was the day Janice embarrassed all of us. She would laugh, everyone else would follow, and I would study the food on my plate until the moment passed.
I decided, somewhere in there, that I would never touch a violin again. Not because I stopped loving it, because loving it had become dangerous.
My brother Grant had been born that August, 4 months before the recital. As I grew quieter afterward, my mother eventually found in him everything she had decided I would never be. Long before he was old enough to hold an instrument, she had named him the family's real talent. He began violin at 12, played it passably, and was called a prodigy. I had begun at 6, shown a real ear, and become a cautionary tale after one failed performance. That was the arithmetic of our house, and I stopped trying to argue with it. The one person who never did that math was my father.
After we got home, I went to the back porch and sat there in my coat. My father followed with the violin case. He did not say I had let anyone down or promise I would do better next year. He sat beside me without trying to fill the silence, took out the violin, and wiped it slowly with the cloth he always kept in the lid, as though drying something that had been caught in the rain. He checked each string, loosened the bow, returned both to their places, and closed the lid with the same care he always used. "It'll wait for you," he said. "There's no rush." I didn't know what he meant. I thought he was being kind because he had to be. I was 9.
I filed it away as one of those things adults say. It would be 25 years before I understood that my father did not say things he didn't mean. I want you to hold on to that sentence. It'll wait for you, because it did.
For most of my 20s, I lived like someone who had misplaced a limb and learned to get by without it. I left home at 18 in 2009 and went only far enough to build a life outside my mother's daily reach. I moved through jobs where I could remain useful without being noticed. Eventually, through a strange kind of gravity, I ended up working at a music store.
It's called Halverson Music, on a corner near the river in Pittsburgh, the kind of place with cellos in the window and rosin dust on every surface. I sold instruments. I restrung guitars for teenagers. I helped nervous parents rent a half-size violin for a kid who might quit in a month. I was good at it because I still had the ear. I could tell when a string was a hair flat from across the room. Customers trusted me, but I did not play. Every morning I wiped down the violins hanging on the wall and never took one down for myself. Once, a college student tried something bright and fast in the shop, and my fingers moved at my sides before I could stop them. I turned away and reorganized sheet music until he finished. That was as close as I allowed myself to get. I lived surrounded by the thing I loved without touching it for myself. It was sad, but it also felt safe, and by then I had built much of my life around choosing safety. My mother stayed in touch the way you keep a subscription you forget to cancel. She called when she needed something. She'd call to ask if I could cover a bill or come help move furniture or drive her to an appointment because Grant was busy. She never called to ask how I was, and every family gathering was a small monument to Grant. "Grant's playing at the church again this Sunday," she'd say. "You should come watch your brother." I went sometimes. I sat in the back and watched my brother play adequately to a room full of people telling him he was gifted, and I clapped and I drove home. Then, in February of 2023, my father died. It was fast, and I won't dwell on it because he wouldn't have wanted me to. What I'll say is that the one person in my family who had never once made me feel like a failure was gone, and the house got very quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. I thought that was the worst of it. I thought grief was going to be the whole story. The will was read a few weeks later, in March, in my mother's living room, with a handful of relatives arranged on the good furniture like they were posing for a portrait. It was simple. The house had come to my father through his family and was his to leave. My mother retained the right to live there, but ownership would pass to Grant. It was paid off and worth around $320,000. To me, my father left his violin, the old one, the one he had played beside my bed. Nobody looked surprised. My mother's face did not flicker. She had known what was coming. Grant accepted the house the way someone accepts a coffee refill, then glanced at the case beside my chair and said to the room, "The old fiddle's more her speed anyway." A few people chuckled. My mother did not stop them. And here is what matters. I was not angry about the house. I did not want it, and I did not resent Grant for receiving it. Sitting there with a scratched violin case while my brother inherited a building, I felt something older and more familiar. The feeling of being handed what nobody else wanted and being told I should be grateful. I had known that feeling all my life, so I thought I understood exactly what my father's choice meant. Grant had received the real inheritance, and I had received the leftover object attached to a childhood failure. I was wrong. I would not understand what my father had actually given me for another 2 years. I took the violin home that night and opened the case on my kitchen table. There it was, the same worn place where my father's chin had rested 1,000 times, the faint smell of rosin opening a room I had sealed shut. Without meaning to, I brushed one finger across the strings and remembered his hands checking each peg before he played beside my bed. A small, dry rattle answered from low inside the body. It could have been a loose lining, an old repair, or something shifted by age. I knew enough about instruments not to force anything, and grief had left me unable to examine it as carefully as I should have. I closed the lid, placed the case on top of my bookshelf, and left it there. The first call came about 3 weeks later, in April of 2023. "Janice, sweetheart." My mother's voice had the warmth she used when she wanted something. "I've been thinking about your father's violin. You don't play anymore. It's only going to sit with you, isn't it? Grant is the one still playing. It would mean so much to him to have something of his father's." I stood in my kitchen holding the phone, and I felt the old pull, the one that had run my whole life, the urge to make it easy for her, to be the good one, to hand over the things so no one would be upset with me. "I'd like to keep it," I said. There was a pause. When she spoke again, the warmth had thinned. "Well, think about it. Don't be selfish about a keepsake." She hung up. I stood there a long time. I remember thinking it was strange that a keepsake nobody wanted had suddenly become a thing worth calling about. If someone in your life only reaches for you when they need something taken from you, you already know the particular cold of that phone call. Tell me in the comments, was there one person who stood beside you when everyone else in your family was lined up on the other side? I want to hear about them. Mine was my father, and by then he was already gone. The sweetness did not last. Through the spring and summer of 2023, the calls kept coming and the tone hardened. By September, my mother had stopped pretending it was only about sentiment. "You always do this," she said. "You always make things difficult. Grant deserves that violin, and you know it." I stopped answering every call. Usually, if I held still long enough, one of her campaigns lost its pleasure and died. I kept the violin, but I did not inspect it again, and neither she nor Grant contacted me directly about it after that autumn. This one went quiet for nearly 2 years. Then, in July of 2025, a letter arrived. It came in a heavy cream envelope with a law firm's name embossed in the corner. Vance and Associates. I opened it standing at my mailbox, and I read it twice, and then I went inside and sat down because my legs felt strange. It was a formal demand letter. It described the violin as a family heirloom and alleged that my father had lacked capacity near the end of his life, that I had exercised undue influence, and that I should voluntarily transfer the instrument to avoid further legal action. The proposed recipient was Grant. The letter did not say the will had left the violin to me by name. I sat at my table with that piece of paper, and I felt a lot of things at once. But underneath the hurt, something else was moving. A small, cold, clear thought. The first genuinely clear thought I'd had about my family in years. Nobody hires a lawyer to fight over sentiment. You do not pay a firm to threaten litigation over a keepsake everyone dismissed as an old fiddle. Something did not add up. My mother had treated the violin as nearly worthless. Now she and Grant were spending real money to pressure me into transferring it, and the letter carefully avoided acknowledging that the will named me. Sitting there, I realized that in more than 2 years I had never properly examined what my father left me. I had heard a rattle, assumed it was age or an old repair, closed the case and put it away. So that night, I took it down. Under the bright kitchen lamp, I opened the case and looked at the violin as an object rather than a wound. When I gently tilted it, the dry rattle returned. Through one F-hole, using the small inspection light and mirror I kept with my repair tools, I saw a pale roll tucked beside the lower block. It was not loose debris. Someone had wrapped it tightly, tied it with thread, and wedged it where it could remain hidden until age shifted it enough to rattle. I used the narrow, rubber-tipped retrieval forceps from my work kit, supporting the instrument on a folded towel and never letting the tool scrape wood or varnish. I moved slowly, stopping whenever the paper caught. After several careful minutes, the small yellowed roll slid free without resistance, still tightly bound and intact. I untied it with hands that weren't steady. It was my father's handwriting. I would know it anywhere, the careful, slightly slanted print of a man who'd spent his life labeling instrument parts and repair tickets. It was dated and signed in my father's careful hand. This violin is yours, Janice. I am of sound mind as I write this, and my estate lawyer has the same instruction in my file. No one is to take it from you. Not your mother, not your brother, not anyone. I read it 3 times, my eyes burning. Beneath his signature was one final line, written smaller, as though he had added it after sitting with the rest. You're the one I trust to understand. Keep it and find out why I chose you. I sat there in my kitchen at midnight, holding a note from a dead man, and I thought I understood. I thought he meant the music. I thought he was telling me, in his quiet way, that he'd always known the recital wasn't the end, that the girl who could tune by ear was still in there somewhere. Find out why I chose you. He chose me because I was the one who could really play. Once, before I got scared. That's what I thought it meant. But that sentence would not leave me alone. Find out why, not remember, not someday. Find out, like there was something to find. And there was still the letter. There was still a lawyer and a demand, and my mother spending money she'd never spend on sentiment. I looked at my father's note, and I looked at the buzz that had turned out to be a message, and I thought, if he hid this much where no one would look, what else didn't I know? The next morning, I called my friend Bridget. Bridget Callahan runs a little leather repair shop 2 blocks from my apartment. She fixes boots and re-soles bags, and she's the most straightforward person I know. I'd told her, over the years, more about my family than I'd told anyone. When I read her the note over the phone, she was quiet for a second, and then she said the thing I needed someone else to say out loud. Janice, you don't hire a lawyer over feelings. Get that thing examined. If the first person sees anything unusual, then you arrange a proper appraisal. It's just an old violin, I said out of habit. Then you've wasted an afternoon, she said. But your mother doesn't waste money, so she drove me herself. Her car is a 15-year-old hatchback that smells like leather conditioner, and I sat in the passenger seat with the case on my lap, both arms around it, all the way across town to the one person Bridget swore knew more about instruments than anyone in the city. His name was Otto Reinhardt. His shop was up a narrow flight of stairs, a low room full of wood and clamps, and the yellow light of old lamps and half-built violins hanging from the ceiling like something out of a dream. He was in his 70s, German, with hands that were somehow both huge and delicate, and he barely looked up when we came in. Then, Bridget said we wanted an appraisal, and I lifted the violin out of the case, and Otto Reinhardt went still. He took it from me carefully, the way you'd take a sleeping baby. Under the lamp, he studied the scroll, the arching, the purfling, and the deep amber varnish. He shone a light through the F-holes, checked the interior work with a mirror, and then looked up at me with a different expression. Where did your father get this? I don't know, I said. He repaired instruments. People sometimes left things with him. I never asked. Otto carried it to his bench and examined it with a magnifier, while Bridget and I watched in silence. When he finally set it down, he kept one hand beside it, as if even the tabletop needed guarding. The label says Giuseppe Guarneri, he said, but not the Guarneri most people mean. It says Filius Andreae. That distinction matters. Outside this field, almost no one would recognize the name. Specialists would. I looked at the violin. Is the label enough to prove it? No. Labels were copied, altered, and sometimes added long after an instrument was made. But the scroll, varnish, construction, and interior work are consistent with his workshop. Consistent is not authenticated. Then what do I do?
You leave it in the case, photograph every surface, and tell almost no one. I will contact a specialist who has handled documented Filius Andrea instruments. Until we have provenance, a condition report, and an independent attribution, I will not give you a final value. But if this is genuine, Miss Dorgan, it is not merely an old family violin. It may be worth far more than the house. I remember very little of the drive home except Bridget's hands on the wheel and her saying, softly, "That's why she hired a lawyer." What rose in me was not joy and not yet certainty. Otto had given me a warning, not a final appraisal, but my mother had known enough to suspect this was no ordinary keepsake. She had called it junk, waited while I carried it home like a consolation prize, then spent real money trying to take it back before I asked the right person what it was. I could not yet prove what she knew or when she learned it. I only knew her sudden urgency finally made sense. While Otto arranged the specialist examination, Bridget insisted I meet a lawyer of my own. Her name was Gwen Marsh. I brought the will, my father's dated note, and the demand from Vance and Associates. I also told her the violin might be unusually valuable, though no final authentication had been completed. She read the documents twice, compared the specific bequest with the allegation in Vance's letter, and asked how and when I had found the note.
"The will is the important document," Gwen said. "It specifically leaves this violin to you. Unless they can invalidate that bequest, title passed to you through the estate." She touched my father's note. "This helps because it is dated, signed, and consistent with the will. It does not make a challenge impossible by itself, and we would still authenticate the handwriting if necessary. But based on what you have shown me, their letter is pressure, not proof. So they cannot simply take it." "No, do not surrender it, sign anything, or discuss its possible value with them. I will answer Vance in writing and request every fact supporting their claims about incapacity and undue influence. If his client omitted the specific bequest, he needs to know that before this goes any further." I felt some relief, but Gwen had not said a challenge was impossible. She had said the documents were strongly on my side and that I should stop dealing with my family directly. Over the next 3 weeks, Otto's specialist compared the violin with documented instruments, reviewed its construction, condition, and known history, and issued a written attribution. It was identified as an early 18th century violin by Giuseppe Guarneri, known as Filius Andrea, the father of the maker most people meant when they spoke of Guarneri. The name meant little outside specialist circles, but the attribution placed its estimated market value between $1.5 and $2 million, with an insured value near the upper end of that range. Gwen made sure the coverage was active before I carried it home again. Even then, one question kept sliding past every practical answer. If it had been only about the music, I thought he might have said so. But I could not be certain. My father was quiet, not theatrical, and he had never enjoyed making people solve riddles. Still, he had chosen the words, "find out," then hidden the note where only someone examining the violin closely would discover it. I did not yet know whether he was pointing beyond the instrument or simply asking me to understand its history. I only knew I had not reached the end of what he meant.
So I started looking, And this is the part where I stopped being a woman defending a keepsake and became a woman pulling a thread she wasn't sure she wanted to unravel. I started with the things I'd never let myself think about because thinking about them felt disloyal or crazy or both. The first thing I reconsidered was the scale of my mother's favoritism. Plenty of families have a golden child, and favoritism by itself proved nothing. But Loretta had not merely praised Grant more. She had spent years turning one frightened moment from my childhood into evidence that I was fundamentally defective, while treating every ordinary thing Grant did as proof of exceptional talent. I could not call that evidence of a secret.
I could only admit that the intensity had never made emotional sense to me.
The second thing was Grant himself. I took out the old photo albums my father had kept and looked through them more carefully than I ever had before. Grant resembled my mother strongly and did not share the features people had always pointed out between my father and me. But families do not distribute faces evenly, and resemblance is not proof of anything. I knew that. The photographs did not give me an answer. They only made me aware that I had accepted every family story without ever asking what facts supported it. I sat on the floor a long time with those albums open around me. There was a photograph from a summer when Grant was about 4, the three of them beside a lake, my father's hand resting protectively on the back of his head. At that age, according to everything I later learned, my father did not yet know. The picture mattered for a different reason. Whatever happened years afterward, Edmund had already spent most of Grant's childhood being his father, in every practical sense. Any truth I found later would not erase those years, or turn Grant into a stranger retroactively. The third thing was timing, though even that proved less than my mind wanted it to. Grant had been born in August of 2000. Counting backward placed his conception during a period when I remembered my parents being unusually distant, but I had been a child, and childhood memories are not records. A tense marriage and a birth date did not establish paternity. I set the photograph down and told myself not to turn suspicion into fact. If my father expected me to understand something concrete, then I needed something concrete, not faces, dates, or a child's memory of silence. There was one place I had not examined: the repair tools and records my father had left behind. His workshop had been boxed after his death and moved into the garage. Some of the tools had also been listed among the personal effects I was allowed to take, but I had never collected them. I called my mother and said Halverson Music could use the planes, clamps, and measuring tools. She was suspicious at first, but the boxes occupied space she wanted cleared, and the estate inventory already identified the tools as items I could remove. She told me to come on a weekday afternoon, take only what was mine, and leave the rest untouched. I went on a gray afternoon in September. My mother opened the garage, reminded me not to disturb anything else, and went back inside. I photographed each box before moving it, partly because Gwen had told me to document anything connected to the estate. Most of what I found was ordinary: planes, clamps, old repair tickets, bundles of receipts. Then I came to a removable drawer from my father's workbench. I had helped him clean that drawer as a child, and remembered that the tray of tuning pegs normally sat flat against the bottom. Now, one corner remained slightly raised. I lifted the tray and found that a thin sheet of wood had been fitted beneath it. My father had built hidden compartments into instrument cases before. Recognizing the workmanship was what made me test the edge instead of forcing it. Beneath the panel was a manila envelope secured with old tape. It had no name on the outside. I opened it in the garage, standing up, in the gray light coming through the one dusty window. It appeared to be a paternity report from an accredited laboratory. The document carried a case number,
collection dates, signatures, and the names of my father and Grant. I did not understand the genetic tables, but the conclusion was written plainly. Edmund Dorgan was excluded as Grant's biological father. The report was dated nearly 10 years earlier. I photographed every page before moving it, then placed the original in a protective sleeve from my repair kit. It looked authentic. That was not yet the same as knowing it was authentic.
I stood in that garage and understood only one thing with certainty. If the report was genuine, my father had known for years. I did not know whether he confronted my mother privately, whether they argued behind closed doors, or why he stayed. I could not turn his silence into sainthood simply because I loved him. What I did know was visible in the life that followed. He did not expose Grant publicly, did not withdraw his name or his daily responsibilities, and continued acting as the father who had raised him. At home, I compared the date on the report with the copy of the will Gwen had given me. The will had been revised the following year. That did not tell me every reason my father changed it, but it established that the decision to leave me the violin came after he received the paternity result. He had not literally wrapped the truth inside the instrument. The report remained hidden in his workshop, but he had left the violin to me with a note directing me to understand why. Whatever else he intended, he had trusted me to examine the facts, rather than accept the family version of them. I didn't cry in the garage. I taped the envelope shut, put it in my bag next to my father's note, carried a box of tools to my car so the visit would look like what I'd said it was, and drove home. I cried later, alone, and not the way you'd think. I cried because for my whole life I'd believed my father loved me despite something. Despite the recital, despite the failure, despite whatever it was that made my mother turn away from me. And it turned out the thing that made my mother turn away from me had nothing to do with me at all. But I needed to be sure. A report found under a drawer could be genuine, altered, misunderstood, or unrelated to the decision my father ultimately made. I took the photographs to Gwen and placed the original in her hands. She did not let me treat it as fact immediately. She contacted the attorney who had handled my father's estate and requested the portion of his file relevant to the revised will. That file contained a dated memorandum from Edmund referring to the paternity result and identifying the same laboratory case number. Through counsel, the laboratory confirmed that the number, collection dates, and exclusion finding matched a report in its archived records. It did not release anyone's genetic data. It confirmed that the document I had found corresponded to an actual test. By October, I had the answer without taking Grant's DNA, searching a genealogy database, or crossing a line I could not uncross. The report was real. My father had been excluded as Grant's biological father, and he had revised his will afterward. I sat at my kitchen table with Gwen's written confirmation, my father's note, and the violin in front of me. None of it meant Edmund had never been Grant's father. Biology had not raised Grant. Edmund had. The report changed what he knew, not the years he had already lived as Grant's parent. I sat with it for a long time. The violin was on the table in front of me, out of its case, and I looked from the report to my father's note and back again. Find out why I chose you. I could not know every reason my father chose me. Perhaps he remembered the child who could hear when a string was barely out of tune. Perhaps he knew I would look past the value of the instrument and ask what his decision meant. What I refused to believe was that he had reduced either of us to blood. He had continued raising Grant after learning the truth. The choice of the violin was not proof that Grant had never been his son. It was proof that my father trusted me with something fragile and complicated without telling me what conclusion to reach. For a woman who had been called a failure most of her life, that trust mattered more than the appraisal or the house. And that was when my phone buzzed with a text from my mother. It was, of course, about the violin. She wanted to
Settle this once and for all. She was hosting a family gathering in November, aunts, uncles, cousins, the whole extended cast. And she wanted me to come and to bring the violin and to sign it over to Grant in front of everyone, with her lawyer present to make it clean. She framed it as generosity, a chance for me to do the decent thing, publicly, and finally put the family's discomfort to rest. I read the text twice. She was going to use the whole family as an audience to shame me into handing it over. She'd stack the room, bring Mr. Vance, let the relatives cluck about the greedy daughter clinging to something she didn't deserve, and count on me to fold the way I always had.
She knew enough about the violin to want it back, but she did not know what I had found inside it, what the specialists had confirmed, or what remained in my father's workshop. She believed the room, the relatives, and the lawyer would still be enough to make me surrender it. I texted back one word, "Okay." Then I began preparing, not to attack anyone, but to make certain I could leave that room with the violin and the truth intact.
I want to be careful about what came next. I did not decide immediately to reveal everything I had found. Legally, I could refuse the gathering, let Gwen answer Vance, and keep the violin without ever discussing Grant's paternity. Even if I attended, the will, my father's note, and the authentication were enough to defeat the demand. I spent days asking whether the older report belonged in that room at all. Grant had helped my mother pressure me, but the circumstances of his birth were not something he had chosen. I did not want to use them as punishment. What kept the question open was that Loretta was not merely asking for property. She was assembling relatives and a lawyer to repeat a false account, that Edmund had been confused, that I had manipulated him, and that his decision had no legitimate reason. If she continued after the ownership documents were shown, I needed to decide whether protecting her secret still required me to accept another public lie about myself and my father. I called Bridget and told her everything, including the part I hadn't said out loud to anyone. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Take only what you need to protect yourself. Don't let them force you into silence, but don't let them decide what kind of person you become either. The line is yours to choose." Then, because she was Bridget, she added, "I'm coming with you. You're not walking into that room alone." I made copies of what I might need: the will, my father's dated note, the specialist's written attribution and valuation, the original paternity report, and Gwen's documentation confirming its case number and connection to my father's revised estate file. I kept the originals secured and placed only copies in a plain folder. I arranged them in order of necessity. The ownership documents came first. The paternity record stayed at the back, to be used only if Loretta continued lying after the rest was clear. There was one question I could not answer before the gathering: how much Grant knew. His behavior felt more personal than a dispute over money. He had mocked the violin at the will reading, repeated my mother's demands, and treated my father's choice as an insult aimed at him. I remembered an aunt once mentioning a serious fight between Grant and Edmund during his teenage years, followed by months when they barely spoke. At the time, I had assumed it concerned grades or practicing. Now the memory suggested possibilities, but only possibilities. Loretta might have told him the truth. He might have discovered part of it himself. Or he might know nothing and simply believe he deserved whatever I had. I refused to decide his motive for him. If Grant knew, he would have to say so himself. Until then, I would judge only what he had actually done. Helping my mother pressure me for 2 years and agreeing to a public attempt to shame me into surrendering property that was legally mine. The night before the gathering, I sat at my table with the violin in the fitted case arranged after its authentication. I still had not played it. I took it out only long enough to wipe the body with my father's old cloth, careful not to disturb the bridge or varnish. His cracked amber rosin remained in a small compartment. I drew the bow across it a few times, then returned the instrument to the case and checked the locks. The copies went in my folder. Gwen kept the originals. I didn't play, but I held the bow to the strings for a moment, and my hands weren't scared. "It'll wait for you," he'd said. It had waited. It had waited 25 years and carried a secret the whole time, and never once given up on the idea that I'd come back for it. I put it in the case. I set the folder next to it. Tomorrow, the three of them were going to walk into that room certain they'd already won.
The gathering was at my mother's house, the house that was Grant's now, though he still lived across town, so it was hers in every way that counted. I got there a little late on purpose, with Bridget beside me and the case in my hand. The living room was full. 2 aunts, an uncle, 3 or 4 cousins, a couple of my mother's friends from church arranged on the good furniture like an audience, which is exactly what they were.
Near the fireplace sat Mr. Vance in a suit, a leather folio open on his knee. Later I learned my mother had told him I had agreed in principle to transfer the violin, and that the family gathering was only the setting for a voluntary signing. He had not been told I was coming to dispute the demand in front of an audience. Even so, his presence gave Loretta exactly the effect she wanted. The appearance that the decision had already been made and only my signature remained. She stood when I came in, and she was performing before I'd even sat down. "Janice, thank you for finally coming. We're all hoping we can put this ugliness behind us today." She gestured me to a chair set out in the middle, facing the room, the failures chair. I sat. I put the case on my lap. Bridget stood behind me with her arms crossed. "Now," my mother said, turning to the room, warming up, "I don't want to make this harder than it needs to be, but my daughter has been holding on to her father's violin, a family heirloom, for over 2 years now. She doesn't play. She has no use for it. Her brother is the musician in this family, and it was always understood that meaningful things would go to the person who'd honor them." She let a little sorrow into her voice. I'd hoped Janice could find it in herself to do the right thing without all this. "Mr. Vance, perhaps you can explain where things stand."
Vance cleared his throat and summarized the position his client had given him. Concerns about my father's capacity, an allegation of undue influence, and Loretta's request that I transfer the violin voluntarily rather than force the family into litigation. He said he had brought draft transfer papers if everyone reached an agreement. Grant leaned against the doorframe with his arms folded and a small smile, watching me as though the word voluntary had already been decided for me. I let them go. I let all of it happen. I let my mother describe me to a room full of relatives as selfish and difficult, holding a family treasure hostage out of spite. I let an aunt murmur that it was a shame after everything. I sat in the middle chair and I kept my hands folded on the case, and I let the string ring out all the way until they were waiting for me to crumble. "Janice," my mother said finally, gently, the trap closing, "is there anything you'd like to say before you sign?" "Yes," I said, "a few things." I kept the violin case closed on my lap and picked up the folder from beside my chair. I opened it and set the first page on the coffee table where everyone could see it. "This is my father's will," I said. "It names the violin as mine specifically. Not the house, the violin, to me, by name." My mother waved a hand. "We know what the will says, that's not—" "And this," I said, laying down the second page, "is a note in my father's handwriting. He hid it inside the violin. He wrote it himself, and it says he was of sound mind, and that no one, not you, not Grant, was to take it from me. He told his lawyer the same." I looked at Vance. "So the entire basis of your letter, that he wasn't competent, that I influenced him, he answered that himself before he died." Vance picked up the copy and read it, then asked to see the corresponding language in the will. I showed him the specific bequest. His expression tightened. "You told me the disposition of the instrument was ambiguous," he said to my mother. "You did not tell me the will named Janice directly, or that there was a dated statement consistent with it." "He wasn't himself near the end," my mother said. "That is what I told you."
That allegation would require evidence and independent review. It is not a basis for obtaining a signature in this room. He closed the draft transfer papers and placed them back in his folio. "I will not participate in a transfer today. Any further communication needs to go through counsel after I review the complete estate documents." The room had gone very quiet. My mother's composure cracked for just a second. It's just an old violin," she said. "This is a family matter. We don't need—" "It isn't an ordinary old violin," I said, and laid down the specialist's attribution and valuation. "It has been authenticated as an early 18th century instrument by Giuseppe Guarneri, known as Filius Andreae. Its estimated market value is between $1.5 and $2 million. A murmur moved through the room. I looked at my mother. "I don't know exactly what Dad told you or what document you found, but you knew enough to suspect this instrument had serious value. You called it junk in front of me, omitted the specific bequest when you hired Mr. Vance, and tried to obtain my signature before I had it examined. This was never only about Grant honoring a keepsake." "I saw the insurance inquiry in his desk," my mother said before she could stop herself. "He never told me what the final number was." She seemed to realize too late what she had admitted. Grant had stopped smiling. I could have stopped there. The transfer papers were back in Vance's folio, the will had been read aloud, and everyone understood that the violin belonged to me. I had corrected the legal lie and exposed the financial motive without raising my voice. Nothing more was required to protect the instrument or defend my father's decision. The remaining document was not necessary for me to win. That was exactly why I hesitated before touching it. I left the final document in the folder for several seconds. "This can end here," I said to my mother. "The violin is mine. Dad made that decision while he was competent, and you knew enough about its possible value to hide important facts from your own lawyer. You can stop calling me greedy and stop pretending his choice had no reason." Loretta looked around the room, saw the faces turning away from her, and still reached for the old story. "Your father was confused," she said. "He always favored Janice. Grant was the one who stood by this family." That was when I removed the last document. "This is a verified paternity report Dad obtained nearly 10 years ago," I said. "It excludes him as Grant's biological father. I am not showing it to shame Grant. He did not choose how he was born, and Dad continued raising him after he knew. I am showing it because you are still lying about what Dad knew when he revised his will." I looked at Grant. "I don't know whether you already knew. That part is yours to say, not mine." The silence that followed was not ordinary. It was the sound of a family realizing that the story it had repeated for years had been built around facts most of them had never known. My mother went pale. One aunt covered her mouth. My uncle stared at the floor. Grant was no longer smiling, but what had been exposed was not his worth or his right to call Edmund his father. What had been exposed was the lie surrounding him. The fact that Edmund had learned the truth, continued raising him, and later made a deliberate estate decision that Loretta had tried to erase. I stood up. I put the pages back in the folder, unhurried. I closed the violin case with both hands. "I did not come here wanting to disclose that," I said to my mother. "I chose to do it after you built a room around a false accusation and kept repeating it after the ownership documents were clear. I take responsibility for that choice, but I will not accept responsibility for the lie that made it necessary. I looked around at them, the aunts, the uncle, the cousins, all of them who'd laughed at the recital story for years. I froze on a stage one time when I was 9 years old. One time. And you built a person out of it and made me carry her my whole life. A mistake and a choice aren't the same thing. I made one mistake. You made choices every day for 25 years. If your family ever handed you a name, the failure, the difficult one, the disappointment, to keep attention away from someone else's choices, you may know the quiet relief of setting that name down. Take a second and ask yourself what part of that story was ever truly yours. You do not have to become cruel to stop cooperating with a lie. I walked out with Bridget and the violin into the cold. Grant caught up with me in the driveway. My mother stayed inside, surrounded by the audience she had assembled, but he came into the cold and stopped several feet away. "You meant what you said in there?" he asked. "That you didn't know whether I knew?" "Yes." He looked back toward the house. "I've known since I was 16. She told me after a fight with Dad. She made it sound like proof that every rule he gave me was an insult." I waited. "You still didn't have to show the report in front of everyone," he said. "No," I said. "I made that choice. And you made yours when you helped her bring a lawyer and an audience together to take something Dad left me." "For years I called him your dad in my head," Grant said. "Whenever he corrected me, I told myself he had no right. Mom gave me the truth like it was permission to resent him." He rubbed both hands over his face. "And then he left you the one thing that mattered to him. I took it as proof that when it counted, he chose his real child." "He chose what to leave me," I said. "That isn't the same as saying he never chose you." Standing there, I could see the frightened boy beneath the man who had helped hurt me. Loretta had given each of us a different false story. I was the failure, and he was the chosen son whose place could be threatened at any moment. Understanding that made me feel compassion. It did not require me to excuse what he had done or offer myself as the place where he could keep putting his anger. "He was better to me than she ever was," Grant said, "and I spent years being angry at the wrong person. I don't know what to do with that now. He's gone." "You cannot repair it with him," I said. "But you can stop using what she told you as a reason to hurt other people. Edmund knew for years and still kept showing up as your father. The lie came from inside that house, not from him and not from me." I opened my car door. "Whatever you do with that truth next is yours. I'm done carrying it for you." My mother called 2 days later. I did not answer. Her voicemail was not an apology, though it borrowed the shape of one. She said she had done what she believed was best for the family, never intended for the gathering to end that way, and hoped we could move past it. She did not mention the false allegation, the lawyer, the years of humiliation, or the fact that she had tried to take property. She knew my father deliberately left me. I thought about calling back. I thought about it for a long time. And then I texted her because I wasn't ready to hear her voice, and I wanted to choose my own words instead of reacting to hers. "You keep saying, you did what was best for the family," I wrote. "You did what was best for the secret. Those were never the same thing. I'm not going to pretend they were, and I'm not going to carry it anymore so you don't have to." She replied, "I understand," though nothing in her message proved that she did. I did not cut her off permanently, but I stopped answering on demand. Contact would be limited, written when possible, and ended the moment she returned to blame or pressure. I left the door open a crack, not because she had earned immediate forgiveness, but because deciding whether and when that door moved now belonged to me. Access was no longer something she could claim simply because she was my mother.
It is December 2025 as I tell you this. The violin is fully insured and kept in a climate-controlled cabinet at Halverson Music, inside the fitted case approved after its authentication. I take it home only when I intend to spend time with it. I have not sold it, and I do not plan to. Its value forced hidden motives into the open, but the money was never the inheritance that mattered most. The last thing my father gave me carried a message no one else in my family had ever offered without conditions. I trust you. I chose you. I know who you are.
There's one more thing. A few weeks ago, after Otto had confirmed the setup was stable and chosen a bow appropriate for the instrument, I brought the violin home for one night. Alone in my kitchen, I used a little of my father's old rosin and placed the instrument beneath my chin for the first time in 25 years. The first notes were thin and uncertain. My hands had forgotten more than I expected, and once I had to stop because my eyes blurred. But I found the tuning by ear, the way he had taught me before I could read music. Plucking a string, closing my eyes, and listening for where it wanted to settle. There. Then I played, slowly and imperfectly, the simple piece he used to play beside my bed. My father left me a violin, but he also left me proof that one frightened night had never defined me in his eyes. He remembered who I had been before I became afraid, and he trusted that part of me was still there. The violin had waited. So had I. If one person saw something true in you, before you could see it in yourself, tell me about them. What did they say, or quietly keep believing, that stayed with you after they were gone? I'll be reading.